what penance could ever cleanse the Christian blood that stains this soul?
Hey everybody, welcome to the Real Crusades History podcast. We are continuing with our series of live streams discussing History Channel's KnightFall series. Here we are, back for episode 3 of History Channel's KnightFall. And I just got done watching it, and yeah, I'm going to go ahead and say hi to my fellow reviewers here. We got Mr. Scott Amos. Scott, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Stephen. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for being here.
I'm glad to be here.
And welcoming back our very special guest, Mr. Paul Copenhagen. Paul, how you doing, sir?
Pretty good, pretty good. Glad we could make it.
Yeah, here we are again, talking about our favorite subject, the Knights Templar. And I have to say, with this particular episode of KnightFall, I kind of almost feel like we're getting into Lord of the Rings type territory, because now we find out that the Grail will destroy everyone, and the Grail will destroy the world. So it's like the Grail is almost like the rings in Lord of the Rings, or at least that's kind of the vibe I'm picking up.
Yeah, that is a good point. I hadn't thought about that, but it is.
Yeah, I mean,
I was just gonna say I'm waiting for Sean Bean to come up and try to steal the Holy Grail from a couple of hobbits.
Oh my gosh! Now remind me which character he played in Lord of the Rings, Paul. I'm kind of rusty.
He was Boromir.
Okay. Yeah, so he's the guy who talked about one does not simply walk into Mordor. Was that him?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and he's also in Game of Thrones, but got his head cut off at the end of the first season.
Oh man, I have to say I'm not really upset that I'm not watching Game of Thrones. That I've never really watched it, but anyway.
No, it's fun.
It may be fun, yeah, but anyway, so
I'm kind of hooked on it now. So I'm gonna finish it. I think this is the last season coming up.
What I heard was that they are actually making shows for it, although the guy has not actually released the book that the shows are based on yet. Is that true?
Yeah. He wrote up to book 5, which I think topped out at season 4 or 5 or something like that. And it's supposed to be at least a 7-part series. It started as a trilogy, then it went into 4 books, then 5 books, and now it's supposed to be 7 books. And he finished the 5th book, I think 6 years ago. I think it was released in 2011, and he hasn't even released the 6th book. And they've well outpaced the books at this point.
Well, I've heard George Martin is a notoriously slow writer, but I can relate to that myself.
He's known in the fandom as the Great Bearded Glacier.
I've never read any of the books. I mean, I started the first one and read about 30 pages and put it away. I mean, just haven't. I'm not really interested in reading them after seeing the show.
Yeah. One would think that writing about a show, or writing a book that a show is going to be based on, but yet the book is coming out after the show.
I know.
You think that would kind of put a damper on? I don't know. Anyway, but we'll get back in. We'll get back into KnightFall. This particular episode. So okay, on the one hand, we've got the mystery of the Grail deepening. We learned some stuff about Godfrey's past, and I guess so apparently the Grail, we learned about some of its specific magical powers, and as far as I know, all of this is pretty much fantasy. Now, although I do, if I understand correctly, in some of the old Grail stories, and maybe you could even tell me if you know anything about this, Paul, but the Grail, maybe it did kind of have some properties like that. It could, like King Arthur, was he able to gain certain powers from the Holy Grail? Is that kind of how it worked?
Yeah, the Holy Grail was one of the properties of the Holy Grail was healing.
Okay.
It's certain relics have certain properties. For example, the Holy Lance, has that property of it can carry any army or nation onto victory so long as they possess the lance. But the minute they lose the lance, according to the legend, their armies will be crushed and that nation will be destroyed, et cetera, et cetera. And then the Ark of the Covenant has that sort of mystique about it from the biblical accounts of carrying it before the army. It guarantees victory. It certainly did that for the Jews, in the Bible, the Old Testament. And, the pieces of the true cross, the Shroud of Turin, the Veronica's veil, if it was ever found, I'm sure things like that, the Crown of Thorns, the Holy Grail itself, these things that have come into contact with Christ's blood, or in contact with Christ himself, are generally speaking more healing in nature. They certainly had that mystique about them. Of course, this goes back to scripture with the woman who, believes that if she just reaches out and touches Christ's cloak, because she has the bleeding sickness that no one can cure, and it's going on for years. She reaches out, touches Christ's cloak. She's immediately made well. Christ says, "Wait a second, who just touched me?" And then tells her, "Your faith has made you well." There's a lot of that sort of mystique around relics that have that, especially that intimate connection with Christ, that they have that healing property.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. So I guess then this idea here in the show, which is that Godfrey, he gave his brother, his brother's name is Raymond, which I think it's funny how these kind of First Crusade names keep coming up. Like we've got, Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond of Toulouse are, two of the big leaders of the First Crusade, and
they're mixed with Arthurian names as well.
Yeah,
yeah, like
Parsifal, and I think there's those two come to mind.
Yeah, and so anyway, but I guess the idea here is that Godfrey is kind of, it's kind of, it's sort of an interesting backstory. I guess the idea is that Godfrey, he and his brother were feuding over control of some lands, and Godfrey got angry at his brother and stabbed him, and then he gives his brother to drink out of, has him take a drink of water or wine or whatever it is out of the Holy Grail, and it cures him. So he can. So I guess kind of what you're saying, Paul, is that is kind of consistent with sort of Grail mythology from sort of medieval poetry and sort of the Arthurian legends.
Yeah, that's certainly consistent with the legends and stuff like that. In a more ecclesiastical sense, it would be an object to be put into a reliquary and then prayed before as an object of faith, one that inspires you to seek Christ, the Savior of the world. All of these, in the church itself, all of these relics and things like that only have the power of the Holy Spirit that God intends them to as signposts to point to Christ. They are meant to, cause that reflection in the heart of the believer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The Holy Grail. There's a legend that it's actually sitting in a church in Spain. And it's on display. You can go to this church. I don't know where it is. But you can go to this church. You can kneel down. You can pray right before it. Things like that. And it's actually a big pilgrimage site, from what I understand. I think it's actually in Barcelona. I could be wrong, but it's so there's the ecclesiastical, and then there's the legendary. You and Scott both brought up a great point, that they're kind of mixing this with Arthurian legend, with Gawain and Parsifal. Parsifal is actually the one in the Arthurian cycle that finds that finds the Grail. He's the only knight that does.
Now,
Uh,
is it Parsifal or Galahad? It's Percival.
yeah, it's Sir Percival.
Well, then the
He's the
post
one.
I made was wrong. I said Sir Galahad.
Yeah, I can't remember. I mean, like, and
I
I
thought it
could
was
be wrong. I mean, don't get.
Percival, and there was another Arthurian knight who accompanied Galahad, but Galahad was the only his, since he was spiritually and physically pure. He was the only one that God gave a vision of a Grail, and then
Yeah,
another point that one of our members, William Cook, who is apparently very well read in medieval literature. Yeah, he said, as far as I know, nobody in the 14th century thought the Grail was an existing relic. According to all versions of the story, it had been taken up to heaven in King Arthur's time. So that kind of sets maybe a baseline for the whole thing. I mean, we're looking at something that was gone by the time gone and in
So
heaven by the time all this is happening.
so
I mean,
yeah, I guess the idea.
reinventing the whole story. The History Channel has just created its own version.
So the idea is that the Holy Grail wouldn't have been one of the relics at this time.
That's right. Yeah, that's what
be.
William was saying, that it wouldn't be an authentic relic at this time.
And I know we've kind of already hit on the fact that this wouldn't be a relic that the Templars would be associated with either, which is kind of intriguing because there are so many interesting relics that we could be talking about instead. But and somebody I know mentioned in the chat that the Holy Grail is kind of it's a recognizable relic. It's sort of in our cultural. Our cultural world, people kind of, the Holy Grail. I mean, kind of everybody sort of knows what that is. But anyway, so I guess, yeah, a lot of interesting stuff in this particular episode. I guess if you want to call it interesting, I am kind of, I'm sort of enjoying the show just kind of on a superficial level, just kind of like, well, it's kind of light entertainment, and I do appreciate the fact that they are kind of giving some sort of respect to the spirituality of the Templars. Like, one thing we get to see at the beginning of this particular episode is the training of young Templars, which
I was going to mention that too.
Which, yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting how they talk about some ideals of brotherhood, and we kind of get the sense of how the Templars were this kind of very professionalized army in an age when that wasn't really necessarily the approach of how our armies were kind of these private affairs where that were organized feudally and organized through families. Whereas although that was changing as we get into this period too. We get more professionalism, I guess. Paid soldiers and that kind of thing, paid mercenaries. But the Templars had a very high level of professionalism that pretty much made them the sort of the paramount warriors and the paramount army of their era. So I'll go ahead and ask you, Paul, what did you think of the little sort of training scene? And I don't know, how accurate was it in your opinion? To me, it seemed like it probably wasn't that close to what may have actually gone on. But then again, we're kind of fuzzy on exactly how Templars were trained and that sort of thing. But I don't know, what do you think?
I liked it for two reasons. One, I liked the idea that Gawain turns around and he tells young Percival, you want to learn to be a knight by the grace of God. You want to learn to be a warrior by the grace of God. Then first learn to be a monk. So that aspect of that little training montage was fantastic because these were warrior monks, and too often we hear really about the warrior side of things, but we forget the fact that they lived a monastic existence. I mean, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux wrote their rule. It's the Latin rule, and they were regulated. As they mentioned later on, we do like 8 times a day prayer, and they were distributing the bread to the hungry in the streets of Paris. So there's certainly that. That level of monasticism that they decided to accent. I was very pleased with that. And that's sort of the way that this would have actually occurred. They would have been brought in. They certainly had to swear these vows of chastity, of poverty, of obedience, and bringing it forward in a military style, is good. I think that, they might have mixed in a bit of modern military drill technique into the dialogue and into that, because at the end of the day, you also want to make sure that your story is really relatable to the modern audience, and the modern audience really doesn't have a comprehension of what it meant to be a knight, to train in single combat, to ride in a formation, to fight in a formation, because for goodness sakes, when we see just more modern, I should say, Revolutionary War movies and stuff like that, people, it's invariable that people will ask me, or just I hear the question asked, why did they just line up and shoot at each other like that? Wasn't that just so stupid and all this kind of stuff? And there's just no concept of that sort of order of battle in a military event in history. So I think they kind of merged the modern drill technique of that sort of drill sergeant-esque Gawain barking his orders at the men, and teaching them to form ranks and all this kind of stuff, with something that probably would have happened. They would have had to learn to fight in a battle line. They would have had to learn to fight side by side. They would have had to fight in close quarters, because these were not rifle wielding foot soldiers. These were sword wielding foot soldiers that would have to get up very close to their enemies, and they would have not wanted to be surrounded by them. So they would have had to fight in that orderly fashion. If they do some further training, sections, as Parsifal kind of goes through and learns what it is to be a Templar, I think we'll see more. And probably, if it continues, then I think they will probably show some better footage and some better ideas on this. But I was impressed all the way with it. I would say it's probably 75 to 80% accurate, at least for what we saw. Kind of giving them the dressing down, the bit of berating, and then telling them about how they have to stand shoulder to shoulder, the idea of brotherhood, and then okay, well, you have to be a monastic as well, and that's all we saw. If we really get into seeing how they teach the sword play, which we kind of saw with Landry and the King later on, where Landry is teaching the King how to use a sword. That's more of that is if they combine that with what they showed with the training of the initiates, where Gawain was kind of barking orders at them, I think that's probably more accurate.
Yeah, good point. And I do want to kind of go back to what I was saying earlier and sort of clarify. I don't mean to imply certainly that medieval warfare was not well organized and disciplined. Like, when I talk about the Templars were kind of this highly professionalized army, there was still like the way that medieval military training worked. It was incredibly organized and incredibly intricate. Like we think about even as far back the Normans, the 11th century, the type of tactics and battle strategies and stuff that they would work on. I mean, these guys from a very young age were taught. They were taught, the single combat, like you're talking about, Paul. Like, the fighting stance, the use of the sword with the shield. They were taught about formations, the shield wall formations. They were taught about, this incredibly complicated technique of fighting as mounted cavalry, the cavalry charge, different cavalry tactics. I mean, stuff that was just that was complicated, and these warriors were absolutely well trained, and this was just a part of medieval Western military life. I mean, I think there used to be this kind of inaccurate notion in earlier times that that medieval warfare was kind of just chaotic and sort of brutish, but we know for a fact that's not true. It was just as well organized, just as disciplined as any other period of time. In fact, there were certain innovations that came out of medieval Western European warfare that were unique and kind of a step forward in a lot of ways. But the thing that was kind of unique about the Templars is the way that they were organized it wasn't centered around sort of like dynasties and feudal households, and which that's the way that a lot of this training was done in in regular among the laity, is that a lord, he's got certain guys who are his household knights, he's got his sons, he's got various relatives, and people kind of learn to fight in these sort of like family groups and extended family groups and regional groups, and that's why for example in the Third Crusade they talk about different divisions being organized. We had the men from this region here, and depending on where people came from, because that's how they trained and that's the people they learned with. And so kind of talking about what that training looked like. Certainly, the tactics and the military training that the Templars would have employed would have sprung from that secular culture. These guys came from the secular aristocracy for the most part. Men of knightly rank would become Templars, and that they may have already had some training, when they decided to become a Templar, if they didn't become one too young. And we don't know exactly what their training looked like, but we do know that they were just incredibly effective. I mean, the Templars were absolutely just the top-notch military force of their day. The Muslims were terrified of them. We know that a small group of Templars could outdo a large group of Saracens. They frequently punched above their own weight. And I always one period of time I like to think back on is the Second Crusade. Of course, we all know that the Second Crusade, when Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany, when they marched across Anatolia, it was a disaster. But one thing that kind of stands out about that, when Louis VII was moving across Anatolia, he had the Templars with him, or he had a contingent of Templars with him. And the Templars were the guys who really kind of saved the day in a lot of cases, or prevented certain disasters from being worse than they were because of their discipline. Louis VII was kind of a notoriously poor general, unfortunately, and he really didn't enforce much discipline in the march across Anatolia during the Second Crusade. And so there was this problem where the classic problem where different parts of the army kind of became separated on the march. It's kind of a lax march, unlike Bohemond and Richard the Lionheart's marches, which were very tightly organized, and everybody was kind of tightly grouped together, and there was no way that the army could become separated. But the Templars, because of their discipline and their ability to operate really with this high level of effective, really good formations, really effective charges, they were able to kind of salvage some of the disasters of that fateful march across Anatolia that during the Second Crusade. But anyway, that's just some thoughts about the military culture of the Templars, and it would be so interesting to know more information about kind of what that actually looked like. What it looked like when the Templars were training and organizing their military strategy and that sort of thing. But yeah, I liked your comments about that, Paul, and I agree with you too about the issue of monasticism. And again, that's kind of one of the things I can kind of appreciate about this show. You know, they've got this character. He's like, look, to be a Templar is to be a monk. You know, we help the poor. I mean, like think about a show, not a show, a movie like Kingdom of Heaven. Kingdom of Heaven just said the Templars are a bunch of basically the KKK in the 12th century. You know, these are a bunch of racist yahoos running around trying to kill people. But at least here in this show, you know, we get to like kind of get kind of a little idea of the Templars as, you know, they have these ideals that they're devoted to these Christian virtues like charity. You know, one of the things we see here is the young Templar novices, they go out and they feed the poor. They take bread to the poor. And this is true. You know, the Templars did engage in charitable works. Absolutely. You know, of course, primarily they were a military organization, but they existed to help the poor, to help the pilgrims as they struggled their way across the Holy Land. So interesting stuff. So yeah, did you guys have any other comments about kind of that opening part of the show, or did we want to move on to the steamy love story between Landry and the Queen?
Well, I had one observation about, you know, Parsifal was a peasant, and, you know, men not of noble birth were brought in as sergeants rather than knights. I mean, I know that's getting picky, but
actually, Paul, I may need to defer to you on that. Could non-noble men achieve kind of the full rank of Templar?
You know, there was a certain meritoriousness, and I think it's actually comes from the monastic side of things. You know, monasteries would take peasants, they would take nobles, you know, they would take anybody, and you know, the cowl of the monastic life, the vows, they were the great equalizer. So you know, you got an education, you were able to, once you were in there, you were able to, you know, you were no better or worse, because you know, when you forsake your lands and your inheritance and everything like that to become a Templar, you're forsaking everything that goes with it, including the status. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, that there isn't status within the order itself. You know, there's certainly room for sergeants. Probably they would have been, because, you know, these younger noblemen and stuff like that, growing up, they would have had the military training just as part of their education. You know, these young knights and these young noblemen, these second and third and fourth and whatever sons, you know, going into the Templars, and you know, some of these first sons, because there were plenty of nobles with, you know, with land and money and inheritance, that made second born children very, very happy by swearing it all off and joining the Templars. You know, these people that did that, you know, they would have had the military training as part and parcel of their growing up. You know, and the lower echelons of society not really having much in terms of military training. You know, well, you can give them a very long, sharp, pointy stick and say, "Here you go. Now you're a sergeant. Congratulations." You know, you can do that. But you know, if somebody, you know, if somebody certainly proved their worth, so to speak, you know, showed particular aptitudes, you know, they would rise in the ranks. You know, there was no provision against that. I don't know how often it happened. It wasn't like they ran around. You know, you know, the Nightfall kind of makes it seem like, you know, they just randomly grab some peasant waif and say, "Oh, you're going to be a Knight Templar now. Congratulations."
well,
Um,
yeah, that's what
I don't think. Yeah, I don't think that happened. You know,
well,
if it happened once, it would have been an amazing event. But you know, if somebody showed aptitude, yeah, certainly they would have been given a sword and said, "All right, well, maybe you know what you're doing."
Well, from what my understanding, the Templars were strictly or organized strictly along class lines. I mean, there were knights and who came from noble backgrounds, and sergeants were men who came from non-noble backgrounds, and the
And
sergeants vastly outnumbered the knights.
yeah, and as they would, but I think it went largely more along the lines of, and this gets back to what is the education of a peasant or a merchant's son, for example, versus what is the education of a nobleman's son. The nobleman's son is going to be the better trained in terms of warfare. They're going to know how to swing a sword by the time that they are 14 years old. The peasant's son, well, maybe they know how to hunt. Maybe they know how to stick a pig with a spear, a wild boar. Maybe they know how to, you know, hit something with, chop wood with an axe. So their skills are, a little rougher. So they're more suited to the sergeant's corps. And they would have, gone that way. So I think you're right, but I think the rationale behind it is not necessarily the social class, but rather just that it's just de facto how it fell because of the education and the training that each of these socioeconomic echelons of medieval society would have trained their young. So the less training you had, well, you're suited for a sergeant because we need people to be these foot soldiers. Oh, you're a knight's son, or the son of the count of so and so. All right, well, you know how to swing a sword, you know how to ride, you know how to wear heavy armor, you know how to do these things already because that was part of your growing up. So we're going to make you a knight and just put you through that. But I don't think that there was any specific prescription against, like, somebody who maybe was born on the lower end, ascending through the ranks. There's nothing that I know of, and that's the key that I
And
know
and here we
of.
have Parsifal has, kind of his Landry is more or less his sponsor, so yeah, he's got an in
You're
toward
kind of.
knighthood.
It sounds to
Yeah,
me, Paul, like what you're saying is it could happen. It didn't necessarily happen, but it was possible. Which that's kind of the
yeah,
impression I've always gotten too.
yeah, and here's the other thing. One of the things that did happen, and it was it was adoption. Adoption and things like that. If a noble family wanted to take care of a child for whatever reason, whether it be like a cadet branch's, you know, children, a cadet branch of a noble house, the parents die or what have you, and the child is not of the age of majority, they go to live with aunt and uncle so and so. And they're raised almost as one of their own, and essentially they're heirs of that particular house. I mean, it doesn't happen often, but it does happen. Um, so in this particular instance, it could happen, and we have a good story reason with Landry kind of adopting Percival, the way that Godfrey kind of adopted Landry. We saw that flashback in the second episode where it's Godfrey and talking to young Landry there. So I think that kind of gives us that sort of in of Percival is given that special exception.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's the, and one thing that I've always wondered about, and I mean, you know, very little in the way of written records exist in the about the lower classes, and perhaps military traditions within those classes that were you know uh, in their own way equal to the knightly tradition and noble families. So I'm saying that there would be commoners who would come well equipped with the skills to uh, take on a military fighting role.
Yeah, and that's absolutely the case. I think you raise a valid point with that. You know, the other thing we have to remember is what we do have in terms of the military echelons training as far as written records. Is we have manuals. We have Vegetius's De Re Militari from, I think it's the 3rd century Roman Empire. Teaching men how to soldier, teaching you how to organize an army. You have, and certainly the later Templars would have had access to this, but you have Greek Byzantine manuals on how to organize an army. They would have brought these things back with them to study, to learn. And a lot of those military manuals really take a very egalitarian approach, because when you're on a battlefield, you can't necessarily afford to maintain that noble blood above all else, because it really doesn't matter if you're the count of such and such, if you are a terrible general. It doesn't matter if you're, for example, Louis VII, if you can't lead an army. There is a certain meritocracy when you're on a campaign. So and I think the Templars recognized that, and I think they were also practical enough to know that the vast majority of the lower echelons probably didn't have the combat training enough to be a knight.
Yeah, we know that happened. That very thing happened with the First Crusade. The First Crusade, the top nobles are Stephen of Blois and Hugh of Vermandois and Raymond of Toulouse. And by the time things really get going, Bohemond is the guy who's really in charge, and he was a very low-ranking nobleman, or his family was his family didn't come from one of the prestigious old families of Europe. The de Hautevilles were kind of upstarts, and Bohemond he becomes the leader of the First Crusade, and that's just everybody recognizes his abilities, and also too, it's like the thing with the Second Crusade. Louis VII, actually, after he realized that the Templars were the only ones who were really keeping things together, he actually pretty much put his army completely under the control of the Templars. He kind of like stepped aside and said, well, okay, you guys run things, because obviously I'm not not cutting it. So okay, cool. So I guess, do we want to kind of talk a little bit about this whole thing with the relationship between Landry and the Queen Joan is really pretty. I find it very annoying. The adultery aspect of it. I will say this: I did kind of like how in this episode we've got Landry kind of struggling with that, and kind of he actually, I think he talks to the Pope about it. Yeah, and again, I kind of like how the Pope is portrayed in this. He's kind of shown to be a bit of a political operator, but he's also kind of a fatherly figure. He dispenses advice, and he's generally a pretty likable character. But yeah, Landry kind of, I appreciate that. There's this spiritual conflict. He's like, I'm sinning. I'm doing the wrong thing, and I've got to stop. And he seems to commit himself to that in this show. And yeah, I don't know. What do you guys think of that?
Oh, I thought it was well done. I mean, that what you're speaking about, Stephen, and the fact that he breaks off his romance with the Queen, and then she ends up, inducing a self-abortion, which was, pretty well known in those times. There were.
It did happen, yeah.
Yeah, It happened probably more often than is generally assumed.
Well, one thing I think is kind of interesting is how they kind of like insert this sort of modernist expectation about relationships, like they have them talking about like, oh, it could never be, but I think that really misses the point about maybe how medieval people viewed romance, which I think if we look at like sort of the poems of somebody like Marie of France, and kind of the cycle of the troubadours, there was definitely this idea of sort of the adulterous affair as being kind of like, it's about romance, it's about sexual attraction, but nobody expects that it's going to change the life situation. Like nobody thinks like, oh, if only we could, go off and be married. It's like everybody knows among the nobility that marriage is, it's something that it's not at all just about you personally. It's about your standing in the society. It's about your duties to your particular dynasty and that kind of thing. But anyway, I don't want to go off on a tangent. What did you guys think about that?
No, that I found that really effective because, the queen knew she was committing a mortal sin, but she didn't speak of it, but that's what by
well, here's the thing, though.
Inducing an abortion, but yet she goes ahead and does it because of what you're speaking of, Stephen, of her obligations.
Yeah, but why wouldn't she just, okay, she said, well, I haven't slept with the king in 2 years. Why not just go ahead and, have a couple nights with him and say, oh, I'm pregnant?
Well, I thought about that. But yeah, I guess they had to play the deal out though. And
yeah. So Paul, yeah, your
story.
Your thoughts on all this, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of, when it came to that, like, oh, I haven't been in the king's bed for 2 years. I'm like, oh, congratulations, you've got the morning sickness, and you've got, you haven't even begun to show yet. It's like literally the only person who knows is the doctor. So it's like, why don't you just take the king up on his offer? And I mean, like, that was honestly like my first thought when I saw that whole scene of like, oh, I can't possibly. It's like, just roll around in the sheets with the king for a couple of nights, and then oh, well, guess what, I'm pregnant.
What a blessing. Yeah,
what a blessing. Oh, we have another heir, look at that. And it's like, all right, great. I mean, that solves all the problems right then and there, and you don't have to worry about anything. But I do kind of get why they did it this way. I think that Scott, you brought up a great point. That it went on, and probably far more often than we are otherwise led to believe, or otherwise would know. I mean, let's put it this way: the church doesn't condemn something unless it's happening. And the church condemns abortion right from the very get-go. I mean, St. Peter condemns it very early on. But then, like later on, through like medieval church councils and encyclicals, it's condemned. So it's like, okay, well, this is happening. That's why the condemnation comes down. It's the church doesn't just randomly pick a topic and then say, oh, I'm going to condemn this, even though it's not happening.
Right.
It was definitely happening, and it was well known enough to become a problem for the church, which means that it was well known enough.
And I wonder how effective methods of abortion were back then. Like, usually what we hear about is exactly what we're seeing here, like the drinking of some potion. Well, I don't know, like how effective is that going to be? You drink, but of course, this was the kind of thing that maybe somebody had figured it out, and it was, it's kind of like a secret thing that was passed from here to here, and I don't know, but
I'd say that's pretty accurate. I mean, well known. Yeah, these potions, and I mean, I don't think abortions were performed the way they are today. I mean, it was more like,
well, yeah, certainly
taking of herbs or potions or that kind of thing. When one discovered they were pregnant.
Yeah, it was
one
almost
discovered
like
she was pregnant.
Yeah, it was probably more like an induced miscarriage.
Induced miscarriages, yeah.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting. You guys bring up, or Paul, you bring up how if it was happening, that's why it was talked about. Well, another thing, this whole issue of an unfaithful wife, this was a big deal for the medieval nobility. This was the kind of thing that this was the ultimate thing you wanted to prevent, because a man doesn't have a way of knowing. There was no paternity test back then, obviously, so it's like this was kind of a preoccupation for medieval the nobility. It's like, okay, well, I want to be sure that this woman who I've made my wife, the only man she's having sex with is me. And there were all kinds of ways that was done. And one of the big ways it was done was through the female sector of the household itself. Like, every noblewoman is going to have her ladies in waiting. And, those women can act as like spies, and certainly the Lord is going to have women, among his wife's ladies in waiting who he feels like he can rely on to give him accurate information about what his wife is doing. Now, I don't think we need to think that like, everybody's wife was out there trying to, have affairs or something like that. I mean, we certainly have examples of, kind of a strong bond or love that develops between husband and wife. But this was a real concern if you're a nobleman, just because, what's happening here to the king, the idea that his wife might end up giving birth to a child that isn't his. And so now all of a sudden, the person who inherits the throne of France is not the actual son of the king. I mean, this is the kind of thing that, especially the higher up you got with the nobility, people thought about, and so yeah, it kind of like female sexuality was very controlled among the aristocracy. There was kind of, men had affairs. It was kind of, sort of a given. Like we think about Richard the Lionheart, for example. He had a bastard son, and that was pretty common. Somebody like James I of Aragon, he had bastard sons who he put into various, small lordships and that kind of thing. So it happened. But yeah, female sexuality. And I think it's kind of interesting how the queen has these opportunities to kind of engage in this behavior. I mean, I think that in itself is what I think is so unlikely. The idea that the Queen of France would have opportunity to have affairs. I mean, I think that's pretty, especially with a king like Philip IV. I mean, maybe like a king like, a lot of people thought that Louis VII, Eleanor of Aquitaine was cheating on him. And you can almost imagine that with a king like that, who is so he's kind of a meek type of king. But yeah, I mean, Philip IV of France, I mean.
Yeah, well, the betrayal, I mean, this whole thing just reinforces the portrayal of Philip as a wimp. And,
right.
and it's like a powerful, a king with a powerful personality would have told his wife, I mean, this is not politically correct by any means, but he would have told her, you're going to be in bed with me tonight.
Yeah, who cares
night, and
right.
There wouldn't have been this holding out for 2 years. I mean, it just doesn't seem
it's
real
like,
to me. It just doesn't seem like, it's just, it's a plot device rather than what would have happened with a powerful and king of strong personality. He would have put her in her place. And
yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that, Scott. I mean, I think that, I had a history professor once who said that the main job of the king and queen was to have sex, which
right.
That's true, because that's the most important thing. And we got to think about it's not just for the king and queen. All these people in the aristocracy want that. They want a legitimate heir so that they have a clear trajectory about what's coming, that they know that there's going to be stability, that they know what their position is going to be.
Because it's just as advantageous to women as it was to men.
Yeah, so it's like, the
powerful women,
right, and I think that that it would have been very important to the queen too. She would have wanted to be pregnant with heirs.
That whole thing just struck me as just kind of really off. I mean,
it really takes you out of the medieval world, But
yeah,
it does. Probably most people watching it wouldn't bat an eye at it. They think, oh yeah, she's not really into him, because.
But in medieval terms, I just don't think it would have happened that way.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. What do you think, Paul?
Yeah, I agree, and you know, the one thing that actually kind of came out of this, you know, and I kind of liked it. I liked it because, you know, we mentioned it last time, and you guys just mentioned it now. You know, this Philip seems kind of weak. He seems kind of, you know, passive. You know, but he's not. I mean, the queen is very afraid of Philip, and she tells the
That's true.
story about the lute player. You know, this lute player was, you know, he wanted to go out hunting one day or riding, and she wanted to
Oh
stay
yeah.
home and listen to the lute player. And then suddenly this lute player is, you know, robbed on the road, and all of his fingers are broken, every single one of them. That, like, that actually struck me as accurate for Philip's character, because it's he who
Yes.
winds up arranging for, you know, in history, it's he who winds up arranging his men to go, not him, but his men to go down to beat the snot out of Pope Boniface VIII, that leads to Philip IV's excommunication. You know, so that's the kind of person that Philip was, is, you know, he didn't necessarily get his own hands dirty. He sent other people to do his dirty work for him. And that kind of strikes me as a kind of person, a personality that would be, you know, might maybe otherwise, you know, on the surface, he might be kind of passive, or, you know, that kind of thing, but you know, he has absolutely no problem, you know, when his ire is roused, to send somebody out to, you know, break somebody's legs, you know, or fingers, as they may be. So I liked that, you know, but I do think that, you know, the queen getting this sort of opportunity to sleep around, that was certainly most likely not the case in any in any case. But one of the things that you know, did exist in the law, at least in the law of England, the common law, was that if a child was born in your household, um, the assumption of the law was that it was the child of the man of the house, rather than, you know, like, there was no assumption that you know, a woman had obviously cheated or something like that. You know, there was an assumption merely that you know, if a child was born, it must be of that man's. So it was actually like, you know, and that social, and that creates a social stigma. I mean, if you really think about it, it creates a social stigma, because at that point, you know, a child is born. So let's say, you know, this plot worked out a little differently. The queen has a child. Who knows that the queen and king have not slept together? The ladies in waiting, they know,
Hmm.
you know, but they're not going to say anything unless the king and queen tell them to. The king himself and the queen. So the king can do one of two things: announce to the entire world, you know, the world at large, that his wife has been unfaithful to him, which not only denounces her, but denounces him too, because it, you know, is a blow to his masculinity in the eyes of the world, because he's a world leader. You know, so he can denounce his wife, or he can quietly accept this child, and then, of course, make her life an absolute living hell behind the scenes, which I think is a far more likely. Like, if that plot had played out that way, that's more likely what would have happened. Is you know, he would have made her life a living hell behind the scenes, and he would have acknowledged the child, but then probably had the child, oh, suffer a terrible accident, or, oh, get shipped off to a monastery somewhere. You know, being you know, not his child, he wouldn't have had any reason whatsoever to care about the fate of the kid. Um, but yeah, I mean, there's that assumption in the law, and that assumption in the law creates a certain social stigma that really traps a man, because, you know, he has a choice at that point: acknowledge that your wife cheated on you, and, you know, stayed out in public, and, you know, then, you know, of course, at that point, you have some questions about, like, well, you know, are any of your other kids legitimate, or was she cheating on you at that point too? You know, are you really, you know, that much of a man? Are you a virile, strong uh, male? You know, can you do this? Are you capable of this? You know, and, you know, you either admit that and bring up those questions when you admit that this kid isn't yours, or you quietly accept that this kid is yours, and, keep that whole affair thing under wraps. So the law and the social stigma kind of, in a backhanded way, work in the favor of the woman and the child, by kind of backing the man into a corner. Now, certainly, there's advantages to the men here, because as you both mentioned, the sexual activity of women was very tightly controlled. But you know, there's a certain tit for tat there. You know, with the that control over the sexuality of women. You know, controlling men in turn by forcing them to you know, possibly even acknowledge children that aren't theirs.
Yeah, those are some really good points, Paul. Pretty much the thing I find so fascinating about the medieval world and the medieval aristocracy is these aspects of private life had such dramatic, you know, public social implications, and also what we would now call professional implications. I mean, back then people didn't, you know, the medieval aristocracy, they didn't have like professions the way we think of them. You know, they were the ruling class, and their, you know, their function in society was very closely tied to kind of their family life. So yeah, it's really intriguing to kind of look at those family dynamics. And so this kind of makes me think of one of the famous first high-ranking noblemen who became a Templar, and that is the Count of Champagne, Hugh, who, okay, I'm going to kind of be paraphrasing here, but I guess what happened with him was he had a fairly discontented marriage. He was married a couple of times, but one of his wives, he questioned apparently whether or not his children were actually his. And in 1125, he actually renounced his title, Count of Champagne, and you can correct me if I get any of this wrong, Paul, but he gave his title to one of his sister's children, one of his sister's sons, and renounced, not to one of his supposed kids. Renounced his wife and took off to the Holy Land and joined the Templars. And actually, one of his former vassals was Hugh of Payan, who, of course, was the first Grand Master. So now he was serving under his former vassal, who was the Grand Master. It's kind of interesting, but anyway, I don't know. That kind of makes me think of what we're talking about here. It's like he was facing, you know, maybe kind of facing that issue we're talking about of like he had an unhappy marriage, and he thought maybe his wife had been unfaithful to him. And I think I have to look this up again, but I think he actually he declared that he was actually impotent. Like he had a physician say that he was impotent, so that he could say like, there's no way I could have fathered these children. But anyway, I don't know. Are you familiar with that story, Paul, at all? I know it's kind of an obscure one, but
no, actually, I'm not. You know, I'd be very grateful if you'd, you know, send me a link to any sort of documentation or you know, book that you got that from, because I'd absolutely love to read it. You know, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. It's you know, it's a very early portion of Templar history. I mean, 1125. You know, we're talking about extremely early, but it's kind of a little blurb that comes up in Malcolm Barber's book and Helen Nicholson's book, and I'm not sure.
I was just going to mention that I'm reading the new Knighthood right now, and it's in there. That story is in there.
Yeah, what do you think of that story, Scott?
Well, it was pretty amazing. I just wonder if he lived out his full life as a Templar. I don't remember that part of it.
Apparently he did. Like, he actually joined them a couple of times, and then he finally went back in 1125 and joined them permanently.
Yeah, I was thinking, you know, I read that part, and I was thinking that was what happened. He dropped in and out, but finally, you know, did live out the remainder of his life in the order. Yeah,
and the Bishop of Chartres actually sent him a couple letters saying, hey, you can't do this. You've got
Right.
a wife. You need to go back and get with it. But of course, this is before the Templars had like really any official rule or anything. I mean, they were kind of a very small kind of group of guys. They didn't even have an official habit or anything, so they just wore ordinary clothing. But anyway, so we've kind of touched on the adultery thing in the show. I guess kind of sort of the last big thing here is the issue of who it is exactly that is trying to keep the Templars from finding the Grail. We have a Muslim character show up at the end, and he actually kind of reminded me of sort of almost like an Assassin's Creed type.
Oh, straight out of Assassin's Creed. I mean, that's what I was thinking. Those fight scenes and all the martial arts and the whole business was just straight out of Assassin's Creed.
Yeah, a little bit of fan.
They were good. I mean, they were fun to watch.
It was fun, and one thing I kind of appreciate about the fight scenes in this show is it's just kind of like sort of these brawls. It's not like
they're brutal.
I get sick of kind of the highly. I understand that they're choreographed and stuff, but kind of the overly fancy kind of special effects fight scenes we've got now in movies, and these are just kind of a little bit sort of sort of just a couple guys sort of brawling it out. But anyway, I don't know. So what do you guys think about this? It's still very unclear. It appears that somebody just said I think that was an escaped Mamluk from Accra, but now it also seems like the Jewish girl appears to be involved. It's like the whole. It's I guess they're
Parsifal's ring.
Yeah, so it's
at
like
the end. So we've got another plot thing that's snaking off somewhere.
It's like some kind of shadow organization that's
Yeah.
That's
Well, we've got all of a sudden got got an Islamic involvement, and we've got a Jewish involvement. I mean, these plots are just all side plots are just kind of multiplying. And I'm not really sure where they're going yet.
Yeah, we'll just have to kind of wait and see, I guess. So, what do you think, Paul?
Yeah, the Jewish subplot, that girl that's has stolen Parsifal's ring and is like, oh yeah, I'll deliver him over to you. I was like, wait a minute, wait, who is this person? Why should I care?
Yeah,
and that was really my reaction was, why should I care about this? Like, who are you? I mean, okay, yeah, I get it. Okay, you're friends with the Jewish people that were kicked out of the Jewish quarter. All right, this happened all the time in medieval history. Kings would get sick and tired of the Jewish people, and they would expel them. And then, a king later on would be like, oh yeah, sure, we want your merchant power, your gold back. Come on back in, settle here. Usually by recruiting the Jews that some other monarch had, said, oh, get out of here. Yeah, I mean, it was kind of like a progress for them.
And the various Jewish communities even had conflicts with each other too. So it's kind of
yeah.
Now, was this girl the same girl who, took part in the fight?
Yes.
That's what I was thinking.
It's her.
Who
She's
stabbed the guy from behind with a spear.
She's like my least favorite character so far, just because she's the least believable, I think.
She just doesn't seem there. And then a side plot. What's the deal with Parsifal? I mean, he's just a random peasant who happened to, get in on the action through unfortunate circumstances. And what could they possibly want with him?
I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, so there's that, and I think Parsifal might be just the I think we've got 3 factions going on. Well, 4 factions going on essentially. We've got the Church and the Templars, and then we also have the Royal Court, including Denogare, and then we have the Jewish faction, and then we have the Muslim faction. All of them, the court doesn't necessarily know that it wants the Holy Grail, except Denogare knows it because he has that whole monologue to his to Nicholas there. What do you that little almost dialogue, aside from Nicholas's little yes sir, no sir, whatever. where he talks about, he's like, oh, I'm not religious at all, but I respect religion for what it is. What do you get when you put all of these little bits and pieces together? You get power. So Denogre wants power, and the Grail for him is going to be power. So he's going to be starting to move in the direction of trying to get the Grail. Don't know how that's going to play out yet, because Gawain seems like he's equally in the dark about a lot of this stuff. But then you have the Muslim faction, and I think the Templars' read on the Muslim faction is pretty good, actually. They want to keep, and I was a little actually concerned with the whole like prophecy thing, because I was like, really, guys? I was like, you have a really good plot here. Like, a really good explanation for why the Muslims would want to keep it out of Christian hands is because, they've just kicked, this is 1306, so 15 years earlier, 1291, they've kicked the Crusaders out of the Holy Land almost entirely. That's it. Acre falls, 1291, they're gone. Muslim, whole hegemony over the Holy Land is pretty much complete. The big threat right now in 1306 is that the Crusaders might rally and come back and take it back. Because if they don't have to worry about trying to support something overseas, then they can gather their strength and sail back or march back and retake the Holy Land, and it would be the first crusade all over again. And so I think that they have a very vested interest, as one of the Templars said, in keeping that symbol of Christendom out of the hands of the Church, because if Pope Boniface VIII gets it, he'll unify all of Christendom and retake the Holy Land. So it's in their best interest to keep that from happening. But then they start like this whole absolutely idiotic notion of this prophecy of, and we get into, like we started off with, Lord of the Rings territory, the Holy Grail becomes the one ring, and in the darkness bind them, everybody's gonna burn and all this kind of stuff, so it's like, wait a minute, wait, where are we going with this? So I wasn't really a fan of that. Like, if they left that out, I really think it probably would have been a good idea. And then, of course, the fourth faction is the Knights Templar and the Church trying to get the Holy Grail for Christendom. Which is really actually, the redeeming of the four plots. The redeeming element of this whole thing is, they're actually like good, fairly good Christians.
They want to get another crusade going.
Yeah, they want to get another crusade going. They want to serve Christ. They want to do that. The only thing that that really aggravated me about this, and this kind of goes back to that earlier topic of, what the Grail can do and all of this. The only thing that really irritated me is, the Middle Ages were really the age of faith. This was the age when people believed in miracles. There wasn't an automatic skepticism that we have today. There wasn't necessarily this thread of atheistic disbelief everywhere. These were people motivated by faith to forsake all of the trappings of the world. They threw aside family, they threw aside title, money, inheritance. They threw aside wealth and privilege to be poor and to go forth serving God and even die for God. Die for their faith. So for Landry to be such a skeptic
about miracles,
yeah, it's like, wait a minute.
was he skeptical about miracles?
Yeah,
I must have missed that.
Yeah, when he's confronting Godfrey's brother, Godfrey tells him this whole thing, and he's like, immediately upon finishing this story, Godfrey's brother is like finishing the story, and Landry's like, yeah, bullcrap. Like he just immediately dismisses it completely, like, nope, can't possibly happen. And then he sees the scar and he's like, oh my gosh, but even then later on, after seeing the scar and talking to Godfrey's brother and realizing that this is the truth, he still sits there and tells Boniface VIII, like, no, this can't possibly happen. Like, he rallies against this with this stubbornness, that really, this cognitive dissonance that just really didn't necessarily exist. in this age of faith, especially for a Knight Templar, somebody who would have given up everything that the world had to offer, somebody who was a nobleman, you know, somebody who would have, gone for faith. You would have believed in, it's expected that Landry would believe in miracles, and he just doesn't.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Paul. Like, when you read medieval chronicles, like especially ones kind of written in a more sort of personal style, where the author kind of gives their perspective, they do kind of talk about like, oh, and then this miraculous thing happened, and it was quite this astounding thing. And yeah, you do get the sense that people kind of thought that they sort of came into contact with miraculous events all the time, So I think that's a good point. But I guess I just kind of missed it when I was watching this show. But no, the other thing too is I did kind of like the fact that we get Denogare, the villain. He's kind of the one.
He's coming along. He's a great villain.
Well, he's kind of the one that's actually sort of insincere in his religiosity, which it's like in Kingdom of Heaven we had the opposite. Balian of Ibelin, the hero, he's the one who thinks religion's bullcrap, and it's So it is kind of nice that our main characters in this show are that they do have their Christian faith, but still, even with Denogare, I do wonder if that attitude existed. I mean, well, I kind of think that, real quick, Scott, I kind of think that.
Oh, sorry.
Well, I'm just going to say, I don't know, my impression I almost get from people who maybe weren't as pious back then is that they sort of viewed God as kind of like almost the way we view, the stock market or something like that. It's like just this thing you kind of had to deal with, Yeah. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well, I was just going to bring up, there's one pope who, now I don't remember who he was or when he lived, but he said how well this myth of Christianity has served us. Paul, are you familiar with this?
I think that's kind of BS, is my understanding.
I don't know. I mean, I'm just saying that I've read about it.
I've heard of that too, yeah.
But I think this attitude is reflected in Denogare in the show. I mean, he's a he's a skeptic. I mean, he's a cynic. He's using the church power for his own ends. It's just like the Pope. Whether it's true or not, it's just an interesting comparison. I mean, maybe some kind of precedent if it was true or.
I just looked it up. Although the quote is commonly attributed without source documentation to Pope Leo X, it is believed to have originated in a satirical piece titled "The Pageant of the Popes" by a Protestant controversialist named John Bale.
The Protestants, yeah.
The Protestants strike again.
Okay. Well, it's just that came up in my mind when Denogare was walking along, telling his assistant about how religion was useful and so on to gain power, and that popped into my mind.
Yeah, and I think that there was certainly a school of thought that comes out of that. Machiavelli doesn't follow along too far after in the historical record. In the historical record, mind you, I mean it's still a couple centuries away from where we are now in 1306, according to the show. Machiavelli's much later on in the Italian Renaissance, but I think you're right. I think you're right, Jay. That we have there's certainly at least a certain level of cynicism that says, we have to deal with this. And I don't know if I don't know how deep that cynicism runs. I think perhaps in terms of piety, I think that there was a certain level of just let's go through the motions, even though I think even the cynics would have had faith. At least I like to believe that. But there was certainly a level of power involved in courting the church and being pious. I mean, if you look at, and this is going back earlier on, if you look at like the Merovingian line, the Merovingian dynasty, there are so many saints in the Merovingian dynasty that were also royalty. It is not even funny, because they were some of the biggest patrons of building churches and monasteries and giving endowments to the church and stuff like that. And like, I mean, there are queens and duchesses and kings and stuff like that that are just, they're saints all over the place in the Merovingians. And then the Carolingians kind of follow suit. So there's certainly, there's certainly a very clear advantage of tying oneself to the church and to shows of poverty, at the very least, a show of piety. There's a certain advantage to that until it no longer becomes an advantage. And this is the scene, this is the stage upon which that first really breaks, when it is no longer advantageous for the nobles to show that piety to the church necessarily, but to start doing obeisance to the kings. The secular powers, the trial and downfall of the Templars is really the fall of the church power and the rise of the state. And that's what we're seeing the pieces set up for. De Nogaret is certainly that leading edge, that bleeding edge, if you will, of we need royal power and it needs to break away from the church. And he's kind of driven by that lack of belief, but he understands that religion offers power. That's what he states, and he, is very firmly after the idea that royal power should come first. And if he needs to use religion, he will. If he doesn't need to use religion, so much the better, as far as he's concerned. And meanwhile, you have the folks like Pope Boniface VIII, and you have Landry, and you have these other very devout characters that are like, no, we swear loyalty to the church, and they're going to find themselves very much at odds with one another. But I think you're right. I think there is that level of piety that only comes from just something that we have to deal with.
Yeah, it's like that's kind of the impression I've always gotten, that okay, you've got a lot of people, who are very pious and do have these kind of strong spiritual feelings, but then for those people who maybe were not as pious, it's not that they were like, oh, this is just a bunch of crap, but it's just they kind of looked at it more like, because it seems like everybody seemed to take seriously the idea of God and the truth of that, but it's like maybe some of the less pious people, they kind of viewed it like, oh, well, you got to dot all your I's and cross all your T's. I mean, you got to make sure that God's happy, and don't shirk on the endowments to the church and stuff like that. So, but anyway, but yeah, really good summary there, Paul, on that. Really good comments from both of you guys. This has been a lot of fun. I feel like we're probably about ready to wrap things up. I'm having fun with the series. I mean, it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it's kind of fun, and I'm kind of glad I'm at a point in my life where I can sort of just kind of kick back and enjoy something like this. I feel like if we were doing this 10 years ago, I would probably be ranting a lot more. But
well, we'll leave that to Rand.
Yeah, this has been a lot friendlier podcast with
Rand
here to spill blood.
I just wanted to make a couple of points here, or a couple of observations that I made, which really pertain to all medieval movies. Okay.
Yeah.
We get the Knights, the Templars. They're hanging in mail all the time.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah,
they're hanging in mail 24 hours a day. We get the Pope. He's hanging in full vestments with a mitre. I mean, like full vestments that would have taken 3 servants to help him put on, like he's ready to do a high service. and
he's doing
hanging
Easter Mass.
all day, where in reality he would have been wearing, a tunic and a overcloak and, probably a cap, that kind, like you see the Pope wearing today. I mean, it's just these kind of ongoing cliches in movies about the Middle Ages.
Or yeah, every time the Templars, go traveling somewhere, they have their horses like in full like caparisons. Like, why would they? Like, those were used in battle or in like parades and stuff. I mean, yeah, why would they put like these big bright caparisons on their horses just to go like up the road?
And the Templars did sleep in their clothes and so on like that, but it just stretches the imagination a little to see him just wearing chainmail 24/7.
Like, what wasn't Landry wearing his some mail like when he was just like talking to the Pope or something?
Yeah. The Pope was dressed like he was ready to give high mass, to say high mass.
Yeah,
and they were just sitting out in the garden in the middle of the day.
I noticed that too, Scott. I thought, God, the Pope's really like decked out for this.
Yeah, man. I mean, he's in full regalia.
Yeah.
But it's just one of these ongoing cliches that I guess directors of movies about the Middle Ages just can't seem to get past.
Cue the Pope costume. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, I just found those funny.
Yeah. Good point.
I don't know. I think there's enough, just this discussion, we've mined enough out of it to make it worthwhile.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole point of it. Like some people will say in the comments, like, it's just a show. God, guys, it's like, well, yeah, we know, but we're using it as an opportunity to discuss history. I mean, that's
that's
the point.
Among the three of us, we've mined out enough to base some meaningful discussion on, and for that reason itself, I think it's worth continuing to watch and continuing to hold discussions on.
Yeah, I agree, and my teaching experience in the college arena is limited to guest lectures, but I will say I have done a few guest lectures before, and I've had people, very serious. Like, I mean, look me in the eye and stand agape at the concept that, things like the Holocaust were real, things that, like 300 actually didn't happen that way. I mean, like, very seriously, people, I mean, I've had people on the street, just in conversation ask me when they find out, like, oh, hey, you have degrees in medieval history and military history, oh, well, what, when did Game of Thrones happen? I mean, people think these works of fiction.
Right there, Paul.
Yeah, when did Game of Thrones happen?
Yeah, I've had it asked to me. I've had that particular question asked of me 2 or 3 times. But that's very, for those that are going to say, oh, it's just a show, just remember, it may just be a show to us on the panel and to, the folks that are watching this, but there are people out there, and this is a very serious warning. There are people out there who look at this show, think it actually happened exactly as this is going, probably because of that little H down in the corner of their television screen saying this is the History Channel. And
that's
by
a good
golly,
point.
ladies, by golly, ladies and gentlemen, they vote.
Yeah. That is a very good point, Paul. I mean, I know that I get that still all the time. Like, people will critique, they'll, in the comments section of one of my videos, they'll say like, this isn't how this happened. Didn't you watch Kingdom of Heaven? And I'm just like, it may have been a little different than, but yeah, people who are convinced that, Reynald of Chatillon and Saladin and Balian of Ibelin were exactly like they were portrayed in Kingdom of Heaven. So yeah, that is the real danger with this type of cinema and entertainment. But again, that's why we're here. So
But this one, it stayed positive on some really important aspects, and I think for that reason, it has some value for that reason.
Yeah, I agree. I think that I was really dreading this series, and I don't know. I think my low expectations have really kind of saved me here because it's not nearly as bad as I thought it would be.
Well, the same here. I mean, I fully expected the first scene to be a bunch of, it starts with a bunch of Templars on horse, and they're riding through like this agrarian Muslim village in the Holy Land, and they just massacre everybody.
Like eating Muslim babies or something.
Yeah, and then they roast the babies on top of it. No, they're really that's where my expectations were.
Yeah, and like the main guy would be the main guy would sort of like say like, this is awful, I can't be a Templar anymore, and he would join the Muslims or something. That's kind of
yeah, you really did have I mean, I even had it. I was like, my mother, I love my mother very much, and anytime that a new series comes on History Channel, especially if it's about the Templars or if it's knights and medieval castles, anything like that, she pointed out Forged in Fire to me. She, like, anything like that, she immediately says, "Oh, there's this new series that's starting on such and such a date," and I'm like, "Yes, mother, I know all about it. I've seen this," and I always kind of measure my enthusiasm. I love my mom, like I said, but she sometimes gets more enthusiastic about these than I do. Of course, she doesn't have the emotional investment that I do, so
yeah.
She gets really excited and likes to tell me about them, and then I'll say, "Yep, I know, it's out there, Mom." And but this has proven to really kind of change that expectation. It's like, okay, well, maybe they can really do a good series about this. And I like the Pope. I like Landry. You guys mentioned it earlier. I like that he struggles with his sin. I like that he struggles. I like that Boniface VIII, does specifically the Catholic thing. He forgives him, grants him absolution, and then says, "But you have to break this up." Am I clear?
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's no bones about this. This is straight out of, this is making Boniface VIII the Christ figure. This is straight out of the Bible, when Jesus confronts the adulteress and then says, "Then neither do I condemn you. Go forth and sin no more." This is Boniface VIII saying, "I'm not going to condemn you. I'm going to forgive you of your sin. But you've got to stop this. This has to end right now."
And then Landry
and Landry does it.
Yeah.
He doesn't continue it. He does it.
He follows up and breaks up with the Queen. Yeah.
Yep. And that's a I was taken aback. I was like, "Oh my gosh. This is like," I thought for certain in their little dance routine there that she was going to get her news out first about, "Oh, I'm burying your child." And suddenly he was not going to have the courage to go through with it.
Yeah.
I thought that's what was going to happen, and that whole plot line was just going to continue. But when he gets his, line out, and then the Queen is distraught, and then she goes and takes the drink, and and he's broken it off. I was like, wow. I mean, I was listening to this again as I was driving home tonight from work, and I just put it on over the car stereo just to listen to it again and kind of refresh my memory from watching it last night. And I was like, "Oh my gosh!" Like, I missed it when I was watching it last night. I was like, "Oh my gosh!" I was like, "Wow!" I was like, that was a very, very powerful moment. I didn't realize the depth of it because he does follow through. And that was pretty amazing, especially for a modern day series.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good comment. Cool. Well, I think we've probably kind of come to the end of this one, guys. But we're all gonna watch episode 4 next week, and we'll be back for more. So
sure.
So are you gonna be able to join us next week, Paul?
Yep, I will be here.
Great.
Awesome. Glad to have you. Okay, guys. Well, this is Real Crusades History. We just did our third review of episode 3. Well, our third review of the Knightfall series, and that episode was episode 3. So we will talk to everybody next week. Good night.
Church on a hill in a grove below skies gray. Lay the sword at the altar.